Close your eyes and picture God. What's the first image that pops into your head? Is it something like this? Michelangelo's image of God on the Sistine Chapel is one of the most iconic depictions of God in the West. You notice that God looks like an Italian, a European elderly man, white beard, a symbol of wisdom. This is a very common depiction of God. Now, your mind might have gone to something more Monty Python-esque like this, vaguely absurd, still have the white beard, and also somewhat angry. That's an image that pops into some people's minds. If I ask you to think, to picture a god instead of the god, you might have thought of something like this. The Greek pantheon, Zeus and Hera, Poseidon, the Olympians. Again, you get a European-looking man with a white beard, unsurprisingly. And if I ask you to picture this in our context in America, you might think of something more like superheroes, who are sort of function like gods for our culture. If you looked up God in the dictionary, this is the definition that you would come up with: a superhuman being or spirit worshipped as having power over nature or human fortunes. This word power is really important. We're going to come back to that in another short video, so just hold on to that. The important thing here is that it's this being that is greater than we are. Now, the Bible has many images of God. If you read through the Psalms, just to choose one section of the Bible, you'll get a multitude. Sometimes God is called a rock. In another psalm, God is called a fortress or castle. He's called shepherd in Psalm 23, one of the most famous images of God. And then, of course, God is called king in the Psalms and throughout the Bible. Now, if you stop for just a minute and think about it, these can't be taken literally. God is not actually a rock and a king. He's not like a rocky king. He's not a castle and a shepherd. But each of these images in its own way is trying to convey something about who God is. So no, God's not flinty, made of rock, but he is solid. He is steadfast. You can count on him. And no, God's not a shepherd. He doesn't have a crook. He doesn't actually lead animals around. But there's a sense in which he guides, protects, provides for his people, like a shepherd does for sheep. And God's not even literally a king, even though we talk about his sovereignty over the world. It's a good image, but none of these images get at who God is. In fact, medieval Christians came up with a principle called the principle of greater dissimilitude, which says between creator and creature, no similitude can be expressed without implying a greater dissimilitude. All this means is that God will always be more different than he is like any image that we use. For instance, God may be like a rock in 3 ways, but he's going to be unlike a rock in 300 ways. God may be like a shepherd in 5 ways, but he's unlike a shepherd in 5,000 ways. And God may be like a king in 10 ways, but he is unlike a king in 10 billion ways, because that's how much higher and greater the divine is than anything that we know as creatures. Now, a similar or related idea to the principle of dissimilitude is this: the better an image is for God, the more dangerous it is. So, I'll use the image of Father, which is more common in the New Testament than the Old Testament. Other traditions call God the Father, the All-Father. It's a great image, which suggests someone who protects, provides, but also there's a kind of intimacy that you don't get with the king language. But it's important to remember that it's just an image, that God is not literally a father. He doesn't have the body that's required for sexual reproduction. And again, for every way he's like a father, there are multitude ways he's unlike a father. So the better an image is for God, the more dangerous it is, Father, King, because we're likely to confuse and think this actually is what God is. If you've done the reading, you know that God is not a proper name, but God is actually also just another image or analogy for God. God is not a God like these guys. But this is one of the closest ways we can get in our language to talk about this divine reality. So we call God a God, but we have to recognize that God is not a God. God is always something more, something beyond. In the words of Anselm of Canterbury, a Christian theologian from the Middle Ages, he doesn't use the word God for God. He says God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Whatever's just on the other side of language, whatever's just over the horizon of what you can understand and describe, that's what God is. Here's a little parable that I think illustrates this nicely. A saint was once given the gift of speaking the language of the ants. He approached one who seemed the scholarly type and said, "What is the Almighty like? Is he in any way similar to the ant?" Said the scholar, "The Almighty? Certainly not. We ants, you see, have only one sting, but the Almighty, he has two." So, imagine an ant trying to understand God. Well, just imagine an ant trying to understand a human being. We're so much more complex. Now, the same difference between an ant and a human is multiplied a billion times between a human and the divine. So, how could we possibly describe God? If some greater being were to look at our descriptions of God, it would be similar to the way this parable describes the ant's description. So, is any image adequate? Well, no. No image that we have describes God in a fitting way. And that's why the Bible and other holy texts just pile images on. We say God is a rock and a shepherd and a fortress. We say God is a father, but we also say sometimes God is a mother. God is described with feminine characteristics even in the Bible. He's called the breasted one in one instance. So God is a father, and she is a mother, and all these things because God is ultimately beyond gender, and God is beyond materiality, and God is beyond language. So yes, we can use these as long as we keep piling them up and don't mistake any one image for God. That's called idolatry. There's a story from the Bible when God appeared in a burning bush to the prophet Moses. He tells Moses to go and deliver the people from Israel, and Moses says, "Who should I say sent me?" In other words, what's your name, divine one? And this is the name that God gives. You may have heard it as Yahweh. That's just a Hebrew word. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. God actually doesn't give a name because a name is a noun. What God gives is a verb. God says, I am. So this God is being. It's just the to be verb in Hebrew. So what does it mean for God to be a verb rather than a noun? What does it mean for God to be being rather than a particular being? Well, when we do theology, when we think about God, there's two approaches we can take. One's called the positive way, or the via positiva. The other's called the negative way, or the via negativa. Via positiva looks at these positive images, king and shepherd and so on, to try to get at who God is. The way of negation says, yeah, but none of those are quite right. The way of negation says we know God by stripping away those images. So this is from the great philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. He says the only way to know the divine substance, we have a knowledge of a sort of it by knowing what it is not. We come closer to knowing it insofar as we're able to remove more things from it. Just to give you one example, we sometimes call God infinite, but infinite isn't a thing. It's actually just a negation. It's not finite. What's God? Well, he's not limited or not finite like we are. Immortal is a negation. Well, he's not mortal. He's not going to die like we are. Well, that's not saying anything positive about God. It's just saying he won't die or he's not limited. This idea, this way of negation, is common across religious traditions. So here's a line from the Tao Te Ching. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Any name that you can speak that's not really who God is. Or from the Hindu Upanishads, God is neti neti. Way of negation. God is not a lamp. God is not a desk. God is not a book. God is not this, not that. He's always something beyond, something more. Augustine of Hippo very pithily puts it, if you can understand it, it isn't God. Same thing said in a different way. A particularly provocative description from this Buddhist proverb, if you meet the Buddha, kill him. What? What this means is, anyone you meet that you think is the Buddha isn't actually the Buddha. Kill him. Get rid of it. That's the way of negation. Any image that you have, that you encounter of God, get rid of it. It's never enough. And here, a mind-bending thought from John Scotus Eriugena, another medieval theologian. We don't know what God is. God himself does not know what God is, because God is not anything. Literally, God is not, because God transcends being. Do you hear the logic here? God is not a thing. God is no thing. God is nothing. Now, Eriugena is not trying to say God doesn't exist. He obviously believes God exists. But he's simply saying any language we use is insufficient. God is always beyond. He even transcends being itself. So coming back to that story from Exodus, here moved up a little bit, Moses is now at Mount Sinai. Once again, he's encountering God, just like he did at the burning bush. But now he meets God in this smoking mountain with lightning and thunder. It's fearful. The people run away. They can't get close. They're afraid they'll die if they touch it. And it says that Moses draws near to God by going into the darkness. So this was a generative image for a lot of early Christian thinkers, that to get close to God isn't entering the light, it's actually entering the way of ignorance, where I'm taking away all that I thought I knew. I'm challenging my images, because every image I have is an idol. So I'm destroying the idols of my mind, of these pictures of God, and I'm going deeper and deeper into the darkness, the cloud of unknowing, as it was described in Christian history. And through this unknowing, through this letting go of myself and my images, I come to know God. So I'll leave you this quote from a contemporary theologian, Rowan Williams. He says, to come to the point where you disbelieve passionately in a certain kind of God. And it's okay to disbelieve in certain kinds of God, even pictures of your own God. To disbelieve passionately in a certain kind of God may be the most important step you can take in the direction of the truth.